One of the more disturbing things about the Vietnam War and the Nixon administration is what those of us in the movement referred to as collateral damage. The war started out with a lot of controversy. A lot of people were not behind it. A lot of us felt it was unworthy. Some of us felt it was illegal, even. But there was a lot of room for debate, we thought, which the administration didn't particularly agree to or agree with. So we muddled along, and Vietnam came, and Vietnam got more quagmired into the areas of the never world. I know I had one client that was in Vietnam when it was French Indochina, before the fall of Dien Bien Phu. His brother had been with the so-called State Department attached group, which more probably was the CIA. But he was in there way prior to the United States officially entering the war. And what he was there to do was secure the opium rights for the United States when the French were to withdraw. French was known back then as French Indochina, due to various meetings, conferences, etc. It got chopped up into several countries, and one of the countries, Vietnam, got chopped into two, North and South. But France for years had controlled the rubber plantations in Vietnam and various other enterprises, mining, and the opium trade. The opium trade was necessary to support Chiang Kai-shek and fight the dirty commies on the north and make sure they couldn't get anywhere or be successful in any way that would disparage free spirit, free enterprise capitalism, or maybe benefit the peasantry, who knows. In any event, there was much discussion about the war, about its legality, about its purpose, but it didn't matter. We kept drafting soldiers and putting them into battle, and in order to entice them to stay in the battle, we sort of let them do what they wanted to when they weren't killing the opposition. And many of them turned to drugs for their recreation. Um, and some of the drugs were hard drugs. And as a practicing lawyer in the drug area, I became really involved in that in the 60s. Many of my clients were returning Vietnam vets, and they returned with drug problems. Our government, responsible for their addiction and things like that, abandoned them and wouldn't let them come home, or treated them like shit when they did come home, or associated them with the anti-war people so they could bust them and things like this. Two such people were from Illinois and wandered in my office one time around 1979, or excuse me, 69. I'm off a decade here. And they had been arrested in Laramie, Wyoming. There was a lot of interchange between university campuses back then, and there still is now. And in the drug scene particularly, you had people using drugs from one campus, scoring their drugs from another, and vice versa. And Boulder was sort of a hub there. Well, these two guys decided they were going to pay their tuition by dealing drugs. They got contacted by some students at the University of Wyoming in Laramie, and pretty soon they were in discussions and a drug deal was set up. They were enticed to go to Laramie with their drugs, made the sale there, and thus got arrested. There were three of them got arrested, and all of them for selling drugs. Well, the prosecutor up there, a guy named Lynn Reese, good old guy, conservative, believed in law and order, etc., figured that these drug dealers were lucky not to be executed, offered them deals for 12 years in prison, and said they'd increase that if I went to a preliminary hearing or had any other hearings. So we had a preliminary hearing in Laramie, and I had represented two of them and a friend of mine named Gene Dykeman, who was an older lawyer back then, did civil rights cases. And a guild lawyer represented another one. So the police officer testified to the whole thing, and he testified they'd arrested this student, and the student agreed to help and cooperate. And he agreed to set up two people in Boulder that he knew were selling drugs. He also agreed to get them to come up to Wyoming so they could cross the state line, because the Laramie policemen couldn't make arrests in Colorado, and they wanted the case assigned to them, and they wanted credit for it. So the intrepid soldier students went up to Laramie, Wyoming, with some drugs and sold it to the informant up there and to his cop buddy, whereupon my clients were arrested, sentenced, posted bond, and we were up here for the preliminary hearing. Now we get up there, and I'm fairly young at that time, a little older than, or a little younger than I am now, by about 40 some years. And Mr. Dykeman was in his 40s and pretty well known as a defense attorney, so I was ignored, and Dykeman was courted by the prosecutor, except for my clients were the main guys. So it kind of puzzled him on the pecking order who I was, young lawyer, etc., representing the big time guys, and the fancy lawyer guy representing the adjuncts. Anyway, the hearing comes, and cop gets on the stand and talks about how he busted this guy and how the guy had agreed to cooperate, and of the cooperation. And one of the things he did was have him call Boulder to talk to my clients. And they talked to Boulder, and the agreement was they'd buy some drugs, and my clients would bring them up here and they could sell them and go home with the money. Well, it didn't quite happen that way. They didn't go home with the money. They went home after they posted bond after their arrest. But the interesting part was my cross-examination of the policeman, because I talked to him about how he called the clients, how he called the defendants to our assistant in the call. He didn't call them himself, his informer did. And we were trying to establish sort of an entrapment defense called enticing somebody across the state line to commit a crime. And that was going to be our defense. Well, it went better than what we expected, because the cop gets on the stand. He talks about it, calling Boulder. Talks about the informer talking to the guys, how they made the deal, how they structured the deal, what the conversation was. And on cross-examination, I asked him, I said, well, did you hear one side or two sides of the conversation? I just figured he was listening at the headpiece. And he said, well, we heard both sides and recorded both sides. And I said, how did you do that? And he said, well, we had this neat little gadget. We took the microphone off the telephone, and we took these alligator clips and we clipped into two wires and hooked it up to our receiver and our recording device, and we were able to copy the whole conversation from both sides. Oh, I said, did you have a warrant to do that? No, we didn't have a warrant. We didn't know whether or not we needed one. Well, did you ask anybody's permission? No. Did you tell the people at the other end you were being recorded? No. Did you ask them if you could record them? No. Did you ask the informant if he could be recorded? No, we never thought of that. Okay, so here you are, you got a machine, You entice this guy to call Colorado, get these guys to come up here with illegal drugs so you can buy them in order to arrest them for selling and transporting drugs. Is that correct? Yes. And the sole intent was for you to get them up here to Colorado to sell the drugs. Is that right? Yes. And you recorded this conversation without anyone's permission. Is that right? Yes. I have no further questions. Well, earlier the prosecutor was talking to me, and he wondered how long I'd been practicing and where I'd been. And I told him I grew up in a small town south of there called Loveland, Colorado. I didn't tell him I had gone to Chicago to go to law school or work there or did anything. And he just assumed I was some dumb hillbilly guy from Loveland and underestimated me. And he asked me if I'd ever done any drug cases before. And of course I'd done many because that's why they knew enough to call me. And I said, no, Mr. Reese, I haven't done any drug cases in Wyoming before. So after my cross-examination, which was totally unexpected, he comes up to me and he says, Mr. Blewett, I thought you said you never tried a drug case before. And I said, well, that's sort of what I said, but not quite. I said, I have never tried a case in Wyoming before. So what he did was he said, well, the feds are interested in this case. It's a federal case, multi-jurisdictional. And we're going to offer you this deal, and if you don't take it, we're going to turn this over to the feds. And if you file anything in this case, we're going to turn it over to the feds. And I said, just like Brer Rabbit, I said, oh, please, please, Mr. Reese, don't turn us over to the feds. Well, the maximum at that time under federal law was 5 years, and Reese was asking for 10 minimum, or 12 minimum, so the feds was the place to be. But I didn't want to tell him that. He knew too much, and he knew everything, and he didn't need an education from some pissant lawyer from Loveland, Colorado. So anyway, we got to work and filed some motions, went up there. Reese told us how upset he was. He didn't like working the case. He thought we should take a plea. And we said, yeah, we thought we should too, but the clients weren't going to go along with it. We got back to Boulder and filed another round of motions. Finally, Reese calls and he says, well, I'm upset with you guys. I'm fed up with this case. I just turned it over to Cheyenne to the U.S. Attorney's Office. And I said, gosh, Mr. Reese, I'm really sorry you did that. I was just hoping we could work out a deal here and work out a disposition. And I thought you were a good, reasonable, patient man, and I'm really disappointed. Well, a couple weeks later, we're in Cheyenne in federal court there. So it was an interesting case because they sent the transcript ahead to the judge in Cheyenne, who was a very reasonable man. And you got to remember, this is in the first year of the Nixon administration. So we get up there, determine what to do. We file our motions, we remove the case, and the judge there, his name was Bremer, and he was a very reasonable person. He was, I think, a Truman appointee, rather elderly. He could have been an Eisenhower appointee, but I doubt it. In any event, he calls us in there and he says, well, I've been studying these marijuana laws, and I don't see that much wrong with them. I'm looking at your client service records, and there's a lot of inconsistencies here that I don't understand. But the press is coming down real hard on this case. It's a pretty famous case. Laramie sent it over here with quite a publicity flare, and I can't do much with it. But I don't think there's that much wrong with marijuana as such, but the press has kind of got me in a blind. So let's continue this for a while and play around with it and see what we can come up with. Well, a few months later, I was up there in Cheyenne, and we were having a conference with Judge Brimmer, and I said, you know, even though our guys were soldiers, they're also under the Youthful Offenders Act because they're under at the age of 26. And that might enter into your thinking. Well, the Youthful Offenders Act at that time sentenced people to an indeterminate sentence, I think up to 9 months, and then it was up to the Bureau of Prisons and other agencies to determine what the sentence should be. But the philosophy behind it was that young people's minds worked a little different. They weren't professional criminal. They were more impulsive, sort of like what modern research 50 years later has shown. And to save the young people from being licensed or branded as career criminals, etc., they put them in a juvenile detention facility for a while, and if they kept their noses clean for 4 or 5 years, they had a record expungement and they weren't a convicted felon, which was a pretty good deal. I had a lot of young college students go through that program. Some of them are ministers now. One's a lawyer. A lot of them were teachers. A lot of them were real helpful, contributing members to society, contrary to what the Nixon people thought, and Haldeman in particularly. So another time I'm up there, and Bremer said to me, he called Dykeman and I into chambers, and he says, you know, I think we've got a way to resolve this thing. He said, if you guys trust me, he says, what I'm going to do is I'm going to sentence, if you guys plead guilty, I'm going to sentence to the maximum under the Youthful Offenders Act. I'm just not going to say what it is. I'll just say the maximum, and the press will print the maximum, and they'll be appeased because most reporters are lazy and they won't check it up. So then afterward, what happens is in 90 days, you guys file a motion of reconsideration to reconsider sentence. I'll take it under advisement and reconsider the sentence and release you guys after 90 days. So in other words, you guys would do a 90-day sentence. Well, that's what happened. And they got sentenced to El Reno, Oklahoma. They were allowed to drive their cars there. They were there 90 days and released. Of course, when they went to El Reno, they said they were going to get out in 90 days. And all the inmates there said, no, that's not going to happen. The judge would never do that. You know, this is a drug case. It's the war on drugs. It's highly publicized. You're here for at least the full 1.5 years before you get released. Well, imagine their surprise, or I can, when our clients got released after 90 days. And that was the difference between, one of the main differences between the disposition policy of the federal government before and after Nixon started his crusade and his war on drugs, and actually the war on the people. I'll have more about that later on through some of these stories I've got. But I think you ought to pay attention and understand that drugs weren't always considered the bane of society. They weren't always considered the product of a depraved mind. That there was a lot of factors and facets regarding drug enforcement, including drug use among soldiers in Vietnam. In my opinion, the United States government created the drug problem of returning soldiers and ducked their responsibility. One of the things they did is they wouldn't release soldiers until they were drug-free, so they addicted them and held them there, wouldn't send them home as long as they were on drugs when they put them on the drugs in the first place. And they needed the sale of drugs in order to buy weapons in order to fight communism, essentially. So it was a real interesting scam that they were pulling. And to this day, the government's still denying it. And I'm here to tell you that's bullshit. That's what is happening. And it's wrong that a lot of our people are still to this day suffering from that policy, from that mindset, from that banality and criminal punishment. It's scandalous, and I hope someday we get a collective conscience enough to remedy that situation. And I thank you for listening, and I'd really love to start seeing comments if you people can take the time to do so. Even if it's "I hate you" mail, or "you're a damn fool" mail, or "we don't know what you're talking about," or "go to hell," or whatever you want to say. I just like some feedback. Thank you very much. Enjoy your week.